On November 2, 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote a letter that would set off a conflict still being fought more than 100 years later. The letter stated that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and would use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Superscript 1. At the time, 90% of the people living in Palestine were not Jewish. Superscript 1. Just 31 years later, most of them were gone. The British were making promises about other people's countries because they were addicted to the idea of empire. This was World War I, and the British were making lots of promises. In addition to promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine, they promised Arab leaders independence if they rose up against Britain's enemy, the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs did. Arabia is for the Arabs now. A month after Balfour's letter, British troops took Palestine, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule. Superscript 3. The people who lived there were Arabs, mostly Muslims, but they were Christian and Jewish minorities too. There was also a tiny number of European Jews who in the late 1800s had started building small colonies there. Superscript 1. The British promise led to the destruction of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel. Superscript 2. At the turn of the 20th century, many Jews in Europe were facing persecution and sought refuge in Palestine. The idea of building a Jewish presence in Palestine became known as Zionism, but it remained a fringe movement among European Jews. Many of them felt that they should not have to leave their countries to avoid persecution. However, Zionism as a political movement took a big step forward with an Austrian man called Theodor Herzl. Superscript 2. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, or in English, The Jewish State. In it, he argued that the only way for Jews to avoid Europe's anti-Semitism was not just to leave, but to have their own. Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, the following year. The attendees agreed on a program which sought, among other things, to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine and promote Jewish settlement in Palestine. Superscript 2. From here on out, the Zionist movement became very active, setting up funds to promote Jewish immigration to Palestine, companies to buy land there, and recruiting representatives to advocate for their cause with different governments. Superscript 2. A few days after the conference, Herzl wrote in his diary, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it." Superscript 2. He was only off by 1 year. The Zionist movement is a critical part of the story going forward, especially after it found a friend in the British government, where a lot of high-ranking officials supported Zionism, sometimes for unexpected reasons. Prime Minister Lloyd George, for example, was a Christian zealot. That the Balfour Declaration was a public statement issued by the British government in 1917 during the First World War announcing its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, then an Ottoman region with a small minority Jewish population. The idea of building a Jewish presence in Palestine became known as Zionism, which was a political movement that took a big step forward with an Austrian man called Theodor Herzl. Herzl believed that the only way for Jews to avoid Europe's anti-Semitism was not just to leave, but to have their own country. Meanwhile, the Zionists assured Britain that their future country would be a reliable ally. The mandate system was established after World War I to distribute the territories of the losing sides between the winning empires. Territories once controlled by the Ottoman and German empires were put under the tutelage of advanced nations until they became independent. Britain was given the mandate over Palestine, but the Palestinian people were never asked what they wanted or what independence would look like to them. Instead, it was the Zionists who were consulted about what their vision for Palestine. The mandate ended up incorporating not just the Balfour Declaration, but several clauses requiring Britain to ensure the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. British rule was very accommodating to the Zionist project. The Jewish community in Palestine grew with big waves of immigration. They had their own schools and factories and even their own militia, the Haganah. And they were led by the Polish-born David Ben-Gurion, the leader of their representative body, the Jewish Agency. 1936, the Palestinians went on strike to protest against the British administration in Palestine. British forces tried to break the strike with arrests, torture, mass punishment, and executions. Leaders were exiled, weapons confiscated, and houses blown up. Palestinian fighters attacked British and Jewish targets, while British and Haganah forces would carry out joint raids on Palestinian villages. The British government sent a commission called the Peel Commission to figure out a solution. Their proposed solution was to divide the country into two parts, one for the Jews and one for the Palestinians, and make that part of Transjordan next door. However, because the Palestinians were a majority in the country, 250,000 of them would have to be removed by force to make the Jewish state viable. The revolt continued until 1939, by which time about 10% of Palestine's adult male population had either been killed, injured, arrested, or exiled. The British government needed a solution. The 1939 White Paper created a conflict between the British and the Zionists for the first time, because it rejected partition and said the solution was for Palestine to gain independence within 10 years with everyone living there sharing it together. Crucially, it also imposed severe limits on Jewish land purchases and immigration. To the Zionists, this felt like a betrayal. In response, some set off bombs across the country, killing dozens of Palestinians. During World War II, more than 60 million people were killed, including 6 million Jews murdered in Nazi death camps. Jewish survivors fled Europe, with a large number of them trying to find safety in Palestine despite the British limit on Jewish immigration. This set off a more direct confrontation between the Zionists and the British, with Palestinians often targeted as well. The Zionists knew two things. Militarily, they were stronger than the Palestinians. And Britain was exhausted by World War II, so it wouldn't have the stomach to keep fighting in Palestine. They were right. In 1947, after 30 years of occupation, Britain announced it was quitting Palestine and asked the newly formed United Nations to clean up its mess. During British rule, Jews had gone from 10% to 30% of the population and owned about 6% of the land. Under Ben-Gurion's leadership, the Jewish Agency was pretty much functioning as a government for the Jewish community. And the Zionist militias had tens of thousands of soldiers, modern weapons, and officers who'd already fought in World War II. On the other side, the Palestinians hadn't been allowed to develop their own administration or military. But as they waited for the UN solution, there was still the majority all over the country. In November 1947, the UN, then only made up of a fraction of the world's countries, voted to partition Palestine. This plan marked off 55% of the country for a Jewish state. But the UN never explained how it could be a Jewish state when half the people in its territory were Palestinian. To nobody's surprise, Palestinians, and in fact, all Arabs, rejected the UN's plan. Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leadership accepted, but they saw an opportunity. With the British on the way out, the Zionists were aware that they would have the strongest military in Palestine. They were instructed to seize more territory than they had been awarded by the UN and to do what was necessary to reduce the number of Palestinians in it. In cities like Haifa, the militia set off car bombs in Palestinian neighborhoods. They attacked villages and forced residents out. Haganah troops drove the Arabs out of a beleaguered city, taking many prisoners. After inspecting parts of western Jerusalem that had been emptied of Palestinians, it was observed that in many Arab neighborhoods in the west, you do not see even one Arab. The Zionists were determined to persist, and it was quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months, there would be considerable changes in the country, and to their advantage. One of the events that helped speed up these changes took place on April 9, 1948, when the village of Dergassen was attacked. A British government report to the United Nations describes the scene. According to the report, 250 people were killed in circumstances of great savagery. Women and children were stripped, lined up, photographed, and then slaughtered by automatic firing. The story of what happened at Dergassen set off panic all over the country. As news spread, people fled, fearing they would be next. Historians have recorded dozens of similar massacres during this period. Each time, they would result in entire communities fleeing. There was always a bad omen of Ben-Gurion to drive people out of there. When they came to the place, the tractors cut the place. They cut it. It didn't come back, and they don't remember the place. By the time Britain ended its mandate, on May 15, 1948, 250,000 Palestinians had fled. The night before, David Ben-Gurion announced the founding of the State of Israel.